Envelope for you. Thank you. The winner is Midnight Cowboy.
The French Connection.
The Sting.
One flew over the cuckoo's nest.
The Heat of the Night, Walter Murch.
It's Hollywood, the late 1960s, and the hottest European trend is sweeping the scene. Like their European art house counterparts, the directors of America are experiencing unprecedented creative control. This new generation of mega directors are acclaimed by critics and box office draws, whilst also upending the traditional producer-led industry. This period saw an assortment of American classics and filmmakers still making waves to this day. Filmmakers such as Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, and Francis Ford Coppola. And among their radical new films are the likes of The Godfather, Easy Rider, and Taxi Driver. Along the way, they're also setting the stage for the blockbusters of the 80s, with hit films such as Jaws and the original Star Wars. Even to this day, the period is a constant focus of film scholars, and often regarded as Hollywood's creative and artistic zenith, where taboos of sex,
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me.
violence, race,
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
and the American experience all came crumbling down. There is a flip side, however.
You know, Billy, we blew it.
Although in retrospect we characterize the new wave as a period of anything goes creative freedom, of pure artistry being hit after hit with audiences, among them there is a forgotten generation of filmmakers, such as the likes of Martin Ritt, George Roy Hill, and Frank Perry. Directors whose work was just as groundbreaking and nuanced as their more famous peers. Yet they're largely forgotten. Not to mention the older generation of directors who didn't benefit from the new well of artistic license. Masters such as Wells, Lang, Wilder and Kubrick all moved their productions to Europe in an attempt to avoid Hollywood interference. In a case of history written by the victors, it seems there is a plethora of underappreciated directors whose works can only benefit from rediscovery. So the question posed is, what has decided this? What decides which directors become the subject of constant appraisal and stand the test of time? Is it enough to be a craftsman, to just create great movies, or is it a case of personal branding? But can personality be useful to our understanding, and is it fully possible to negate it? To answer this, we must look to the legendary director John Huston.
It's all right to borrow from each other. What we must never do is borrow from ourselves. Come on.
An oddity of the cinematic landscape, Huston paradoxically strides the line between craftsman and auteur, often reluctantly or unintentionally. As a result, Huston was one of the few directors of the classical Hollywood period to somewhat haphazardly transition to the new Hollywood style of filmmaking. As a strong personality in the studio system and a writer, Huston made his films undeniably his. Yet his films all fit into the traditional Hollywood method. Too much of an auteur for classical Hollywood, and too much of a craftsman for the new. But before we can dive into Huston himself, we must first go into that monolith of film theory, the auteur. Auteur theory began like many things with cinema, the French. Although the notion of the director being the most important person to a film existed almost as long as narrative filmmaking. The directing category is as old as the Oscars themselves. But it wasn't till the likes of Andrew Sarris, Francois Truffaut, and the rest of the Cahiers du Cinema crew till the auteur ball really got rolling. They first postulated the theory as a pushback against what Truffaut called France's cinema of quality. that directors were too slavish to scripts and literary sources, whilst the truly great directors took liberties with the material.
Quelle est votre plus grande ambition dans la vie?
Je vais jusqu'où?
Devenir immortel. Et puis mourir.
They praise directors whom they believe left a personal mark on their films. Directors such as Chaplin and Hitchcock. The theory deposited directors as like the author of a book, hence the auteur, placing great emphasis on a director's singular vision and style, tracking their evolution as an artist, letting the artist's personal life influence their interpretation. Although auteur theory does have a place in film analysis, its origins can largely be seen as a way to get films accepted as a serious art form, drawing upon romantic notions of a spirited and willful artist. There are, however, several notable problems with auteur theory. Perhaps most notably and damnedly is that film productions are largely collaborative. Watch for the credits of your favourite films and you will see, with a few exceptions, especially in the case of some animations, that any film will have anywhere from dozens to thousands of crew. Additionally, there's Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, which renders any artistic intention mute. Auteur theory's framework, whilst at times useful, can also be reductive. John Huston's style can generally be categorized as straightforward and unobtrusive, trying to be left unfelt in his films. Yet whether or not he actually wants it, we cannot fully remove Huston from his works, and so we must ask ourselves, is Huston an auteur? Andrew Sarris is perhaps one of the most important people to auteur theory, helping bring the theory from Europe to America at the cusp of the Hollywood New Wave. He outlined these requirements for an auteur. First, technical competence, which with one look at Huston's filmography and the number of classics he's made quickly qualifies him. Secondly, is a distinct personality. Do their films have a certain feel to them that can be linked to the director, that only someone of their character could have made, such as the art design of a Tim Burton film? Lastly is interior meaning, meaning does their filmography reflect the personal views of the author? So does Huston fit the title auteur? First we must find if Huston has a recognizable visual style. Whilst Huston may have had a hand in several of his film screenplays, the way he composes and blocks his films isn't particularly distinguishable from the rest of classical Hollywood. Huston generally subscribed to the Hawksian ideology of avoiding overly intrusive camera work, which for him had to be primarily organically motivated, such as character movement. This can be frequently seen in his earlier works. Whilst it is true that Huston's style did evolve to much more of a gritty, raw realism, such as with Fat City, this was arguably still in keeping with the industry's shift in the late 60s to grittier storytelling, rather than a creative choice. Whilst on screen, Huston's style may be standard, his on-set method was unorthodox, helping to imprint himself on his films. He foregoed the traditional shooting style of coverage, instead carefully composing each shot using his skills learned as an artist. This was done in a manner described by Michael Caine as like a sniper. By doing this, Huston avoided the editor, essentially editing in camera. Whilst his style may have not been radical, as writer, director, and de facto editor, he maintained a tight control on his films. Although, by deliberately avoiding the editor, Huston is recognizing the creative power held by those other than himself, realizing the editor's potential and power to massively reshape a film. However, although his style may not have been particularly distinct, as say that of someone like David Lynch, we must consider this, something very often not regarded, that perhaps Huston's personal style was that of classical Hollywood, that he wasn't forced into traditional filmmaking, but chose it out of creative preference. This brings us to what I term vulgar auteurism. It seems to be that those often recognised as an auteur aren't so much those with a personal style, but those whose style is incredibly overt and easy to identify. These are the directors that fit more easily into the overly romantic notion of artists that strongly underlined auteur theory, as often it does not apply to directors with personal styles, but those whose style is overt and easy to identify personal brand, often failing to appreciate and understand the work of their more restrained counterparts. Huston's directorial stylings may be nebulous, but his personality certainly wasn't. As mentioned earlier, one of the key components of an auteur is an artist with a distinct personality and interior meaning. In short, an artist who lets themselves bleed into their work. Even if not intentional, Huston's private life shows up in his works in several ways, such as the frequent use of family members like his father Walter and daughter Angelica, both winning Academy Awards under his direction. He even quite literally shows up in person across his filmography. And his simple and restrained ethos to filmmaking can be seen as an extension to his macho, straight-talking persona, the typical Hemingway-esque artist of the early 20th century. Perhaps most egregious of all is not even in a Huston film, but in a work of Orson Welles, The Other Side of the Wind. Now, we could dismiss this film as it's not from Huston. However, there are strong arguments for film stars as auteurs, as individuals whose filmography contains a recognizable style. But this film has Huston literally playing himself, or rather, an idea of himself and other maverick directors of the early 20th century. Although the character of Jake Hannaford can be more easily identified as Welles himself, the character's relationship to Peter Bogdanovich being particularly telling. I can either use an auteurist argument, that Welles himself denied any biographical intent, or a non-auteurist, like Death of the Author, further highlighting the problematic nature of the auteur, but also providing valuable insights. The film stars Huston as an aging film director at the crossroads of the new Hollywood movement. The director is notably Hemingway-esque, dying on the same day as Hemingway, and satirizing his macho image with his implied homosexuality. Of course, in order to do this, Welles cast Huston for his own macho image, known in the industry for his independent spirit. Huston's life was full of episodes that themselves resembled movies, being part of the Mexican cavalry, boxing, and painting on the streets of Paris. A cadre of macho underdogs permeate his works. There are several other elements of Huston's personal life that repeatedly crop up in his films, like his love for Mexico and Ireland, or his long-running friendship and collaboration with Humphrey Bogart. Huston is a textbook example of this anomaly, controlling and exacting their creative process, yet never trying to repeat themselves with an eclectic filmography. Whilst his work may be too diverse to pinpoint a certain oeuvre, his celebrity is too strongly tied into his works to be separated. This helps him to slip by with the mega directors into the Hollywood new wave. In their attempt to push back against the cinema of quality, they have erroneously failed to take a multitude of directors seriously, falsely equating the overt with the personal. Auteur theory even likes the idea, with many looking to champion undervalued directors, tapping into the romantic ideal of the misunderstood genius. But until then, maybe we can learn something from the career of Huston, not to be swept up by larger-than-life personalities and flashy camera work. Not to reduce film criticism to simple biographical-based cause and effect and cult of personalities. Yet, auteurism is still extremely insightful, and must be commended for helping to move film's perception away from commercialised products. Perhaps if the label of auteur was extended to more, with diverse voices so strongly needed in film. We need to look past a pre-established canon of film directors and build something new and nuanced.
How about it?
It's a deal.
Well, let's get going. Well, goodbye, Curtin.
Goodbye, Howard.
Good luck.
Same to you.